Dear viewers, welcome to our channel. Subscribe to receive more stories every day. Emma Reynolds had spent 20 years building a life with Richard. 20 years of sacrifices, love, and trust. And in a matter of minutes, it had all come crashing down. She sat in the cold, dimly lit courtroom, her hands clenched together in her lap. The scent of polished wood and old paper filled the air, mingling with the hushed murmurs of attorneys exchanging pleasantries. Across from her, Richard leaned back in his chair with an air of smug confidence, his arm resting just a little too comfortably on the back of the chair next to him, the chair occupied by a woman at least 15 years younger than Emma. Anya, the mistress, the woman Richard had thrown his entire life away for. Emma swallowed hard, forcing back the lump in her throat. She wouldn't let them see her break. Not him. Not her. Not the people whispering at the back of the courtroom, likely eager to watch her humiliation unfold. Her lawyer, Jonathan Pierce, had assured her they had a fighting chance. But as she listened to Richard's attorney confidently lay out his case, a sickening realization set in. Richard had planned this meticulously. Every asset had been shifted, every account adjusted. And the prenuptial agreement she had foolishly signed all those years ago left her with next to nothing. Her stomach twisted as Richard's lawyer stood, his tone laced with carefully curated sympathy. "Your Honor, my client, Mr. Reynolds, has been more than fair. The prenuptial agreement clearly stipulates that in the event of a divorce, Mrs. Reynolds is entitled to a modest settlement, which my client has graciously agreed to honor. Furthermore, the properties, businesses, and investments in question were accumulated solely through Mr. Reynolds' hard work and diligence." Emma felt her nails dig into her palms. Solely his hard work. Had she not stood beside him, supporting him through the failures, the late nights, the impossible decisions? Had she not managed their home, their finances, their lives while he pursued his ambitions? She glanced at Jonathan, who sat unervingly calm, a knowing look in his eyes. He hadn't spoken yet, hadn't argued, hadn't objected. What was he waiting for? Richard's lawyer continued, listing off the assets that Emma had already known were being stripped from her. The summer house in Napa, the investment properties in the city, the stock options, all gone. All untouchable due to that wretched prenup. Emma had felt prepared for this moment, but now, sitting here, hearing it all laid out so callously, she could feel her strength wavering. Tanya was smirking, her manicured nails tapping absently against the wooden table as if she were growing impatient. And then Richard spoke. "Emma," he said smoothly, with that sickeningly patronizing tone he had perfected over the years. "I know this is hard for you. But we both knew this day would come eventually. Let's not make this uglier than it has to be." Her vision blurred for a second. This day would come. As if she had spent years bracing for the inevitable betrayal. As if she had always known he would discard her the moment he found something, or someone new. Jonathan finally moved, adjusting his tie as he stood. "Your Honor," he said, his voice calm yet commanding. "We acknowledge the prenuptial agreement and the terms laid out. However, there is an additional matter that must be addressed before a ruling is made." Richard scoffed, leaning forward. "Oh, for God's sake, Jonathan, let's not drag this out any longer than we have to." Jonathan didn't even glance his way. Instead, he reached into his briefcase and retrieved a file, placing it neatly in front of him before sliding a single page toward the judge. Emma's heart pounded. What was that? The judge adjusted her glasses, peering down at the document. There was a pause, a long lingering pause. Richard's smug expression faltered ever so slightly. "Mr. Pierce," the judge said slowly, "are you certain about this?" Jonathan nodded. "Absolutely, Your Honor. This document, signed by Mr. Reynolds' late father, Robert Reynolds, is an inheritance contract. It stipulates that in the event of a divorce, Mrs. Reynolds is entitled to half of the Reynolds family estate. An estate that, I should note, includes several of the properties and business holdings currently being disputed in this case. The courtroom fell silent. Tanya's tapping fingers froze mid-air. Richard's attorney visibly paled. Emma blinked, trying to process what she had just heard. Half. She was entitled to half of his inheritance. She looked at Richard, whose once smug expression had darkened into something cold and unreadable. He opened his mouth as if to protest, but no words came. Tanya turned to him, whispering something in frantic urgency. The shift in power was almost tangible. And then, for the first time since walking into the courtroom, Emma saw something she hadn't expected. Her own lawyer, Jonathan Pierce, smirked. The silence in the courtroom stretched, thick and suffocating. Richard's fingers twitched against the table, his once relaxed demeanor now rigid with tension. Emma sat frozen, heart hammering in her chest. Had she heard that right? The judge cleared her throat, her gaze moving to Richard's lawyer. "Mr. Calloway, do you have any response to this?" The man hesitated, a moment too long. His silence only deepened the weight of the revelation. Richard, however, was less composed. "This is ridiculous," Richard snapped, his voice laced with frustration. "That document can't be valid. My father left me that inheritance years before I even married Emma." Jonathan remained calm, methodically flipping through another set of papers. "Actually, Mr. Reynolds, the contract states that as long as the estate remained under your name, it would be joint marital property in the event of a divorce. Your father intended for his wealth to be shared with your wife, should she ever be wrongfully cast aside." Emma felt a strange sensation rising in her chest, a mix of disbelief and something she hadn't allowed herself to feel since Richard first asked for a divorce. "Hope." Richard shook his head, laughing under his breath, but there was nothing amused about it. His eyes darted to his lawyer. "You knew about this?" Calloway wiped a hand across his brow. We were unaware of the document's binding nature." "Unaware?" Richard seethed. "I'm paying you an absurd amount of money so that things like this don't happen." Emma watched, transfixed. The man who had walked into this courtroom dripping with arrogance, with his mistress smirking by his side, was unraveling before her eyes. Tanya, for her part, had lost all amusement. She leaned into Richard, whispering fiercely. Emma couldn't hear everything, but she caught the frantic, hissed words. "You said she wouldn't get anything." A shiver ran down Emma's spine. Tanya wasn't just a mistress enjoying the spoils of stolen love. She had been banking on Richard's fortune. Jonathan, ever composed, turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, given the undeniable validity of this contract, we request that the division of assets be revisited under these new terms." The judge nodded thoughtfully. "We will take a recess before making a final ruling." A low, distressed curse left Richard's lips. His perfect little plan, the one that left Emma with scraps while he built a shiny new life, was falling apart in real time. Emma couldn't stop herself. She turned, meeting his gaze for the first time since this ordeal began. He expected to see the same woman he had humiliated, the one who cried when she found the divorce papers, who begged him to reconsider, who had spent sleepless nights wondering what she had done wrong. Instead, he found someone else entirely. Emma smiled. And Richard, for the first time since she'd known him, he looked afraid. The courtroom doors swung open, signaling the end of recess. Emma took a steady breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle around her. This was it, the final act of a battle she never wanted to fight, but one she refused to lose. Richard returned to his seat, his previously smug demeanor now replaced with something bordering on desperation. His lawyer, Calloway, was still furiously flipping through legal documents, hoping to find a loophole to undo the damage. Tanya sat stiffly, her arms crossed, her expression stormy. Emma almost laughed at the sight. The mistress, once so eager to bask in her stolen victory, was now watching her so-called prize crumble in real time. Jonathan remained composed, but Emma noticed the faintest flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. He knew. They had already won. The judge adjusted her glasses, glancing at the documents in front of her before addressing the court. "I've reviewed the inheritance contract," she began, her voice clear and steady. "And after careful consideration, it is my determination that the terms are binding. Mrs. Reynolds is, in fact, legally entitled to half of the Reynolds estate." A hush fell over the courtroom. Richard tensed, gripping the edges of the table. Tanya's expression darkened, her foot tapping anxiously against the floor. The judge continued. "Given that Mr. Reynolds was aware of this contract and failed to disclose it during these proceedings, I am also ruling that Mrs. Reynolds shall receive an additional compensatory amount for any financial discrepancies that may have occurred during the time of their separation." Emma barely had time to process before Richard shot out of his seat. "This is insane," he bellowed, his voice echoing off the courtroom walls. "You're telling me that after everything I built, she gets to take half of it? For what? Sitting at home while I did the real work?" A stunned silence followed his outburst. Emma exhaled slowly, forcing herself to remain composed, but Jonathan wasn't about to let that comment slide. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "perhaps we should remind Mr. Reynolds that Mrs. Reynolds wasn't just sitting at home. She managed household finances, supported him through his business ventures, and let's not forget, sacrificed her own career so he could build what he now so conveniently calls his empire." Richard opened his mouth, but Jonathan cut him off before he could argue. "And since we're on the subject of honesty," he continued, "we also have bank statements that show Mr. Reynolds recently transferred a substantial amount of money to an offshore account, an attempt, no doubt, to shield those funds from Mrs. Reynolds." Gasps rippled through the room. Emma's heart pounded. She hadn't even known about that. Richard's lawyer stiffened, flipping pages in his folder. We object to this accusation." Jonathan raised a hand. "You can object all you want. The paper trail doesn't lie." He turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, not only did Mr. Reynolds attempt to hide assets, but this blatant deception violates marital property laws. I believe additional penalties should be considered." The judge gave Richard a hard look. "Mr. Reynolds, do you have anything to say for yourself?" For the first time, Richard looked trapped. His face was red, his mouth pressed into a thin line. He had nothing. No excuse, no lie, no easy way out. Tanya, clearly realizing the money she had been banking on was slipping through her fingers, turned to him sharply. "You told me she wouldn't get anything," she whispered, her voice sharp as glass. "You promised me this was handled." Emma watched as Richard's perfect world collapsed around him. Tanya, who once looked at him with admiration and greed, now glared at him with disgust. The mistress didn't sign up for a broke man. And then, as if this moment couldn't be more poetic, the judge delivered the final blow. "In light of these new findings, I am revising the division of assets. Not only will Mrs. Reynolds receive her rightful half, but due to Mr. Reynolds' attempt at financial deception, she will also be awarded an additional 10% as a penalty." Richard sank into his seat, looking physically ill. 10% might not sound like much, but in their world it was millions. Tanya visibly paled. And Emma, for the first time in years, she felt like she could breathe. The gavel slammed down, finalizing the ruling. Court was adjourned. The aftermath. Emma stepped out of the courthouse into the crisp afternoon air, the sun warming her face. It was over. She had won. Behind her, Richard and Tanya lingered on the steps, locked in a heated argument. Emma didn't need to hear the words to know what was happening. Tanya was furious, angry that the man she thought would shower her in luxury had just lost everything. And Richard, he was no longer the smug, untouchable businessman. He was just a bitter, broke man who gambled and lost. Emma turned away, not sparing them another glance. She had spent enough of her life thinking about Richard Reynolds. Today was the start of something new. She smiled, stepping forward toward her future. Dear viewers, thank you for watching. If you like this story, please subscribe to our channel to receive more stories every day. Share with us what you think of this story and tell us where you're watching from.